Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this Red Gaming Tech.com video, we're going to be taking a look at this. He says, trying to actually get it in camera because the box is huge. An RTX 3080 Gaming X Trio. This is obviously MSI's variant. I'm just going to put that there so it doesn't block out the sun. Yeah, so this card was actually sent to me by MSI just over a week ago now, and if you're a regular viewer, first of all, commiserations to you, but you'll know that I am pretty much timing this the worst way possible because I'm actually in the process of moving. A lot of stuff has now been shifted over to my new place where I am currently. So the Ampere launch and obviously subsequent review samples for me have been rather interesting. MSI did send this over for testing purposes, but I don't get to keep the card. It's going back, so it's only a loaner sample. However, we will be continuing RTX 30 coverage thanks to Nvidia, but that will be in the subsequent couple of weeks, including hopefully the 3070. And for those wondering, there will also be extensive coverage of the RX 6000 series GPUs as of the time that I'm recording this anyway. Nvidia are kind of the only ones with their next generation cards on the market, with AMD announcing their cards on the 28th. So that's just around 20-ish days from now as of the time, again, that I'm recording this video. So it's going to be very interesting to see how Nvidia and AMD kind of square off against one another in the marketplace. But with that said, I have had some time now to test out the RTX 3080 from MSI, and I have to say that the card is actually pretty damn great. I've got some benchmarks which we'll go over in just a moment, but first of all, as always, let's start out by just a quick overview of the specifications of the GPU, and we'll also look into the aesthetics of it too. Then we'll go into the benchmarks, then of course we'll finish off with the conclusions. Starting with the aesthetics, this GPU is very reminiscent of what we've seen from previous entries in MSI's Gaming X Trio lineup, with dark colour schemes and a triple fan design. The 3080 though is monstrous, eating up 3 PCIe slots and coming in at 12.3 inches in length. I would highly suggest, if it's not already obvious, to make sure that if you do have a smaller case, that this thing will even fit inside of it. For the cooling solution, the GPU for the fan uses Torx Fan 4 along with tweaks to the Trio Frozer cooling system. This keeps the card quiet and cool. As usual for a design like this, the fans don't spin up unless under a heavier sustained load. This means that if you're playing a retro game, light gaming, or just say on the desktop, the fans do absolutely nothing because the huge cooler keeps temperatures under control. Our sample on heavier sustained loads, though this is in British autumn with a cooler room, temperatures would typically be between 65 and 68 C, which is a degree or so cooler than our Founders Edition card under similar tests. For colour scheme, the darker greys and blacks are in full force here, and doesn't do really anything bold or new in terms of raw aesthetics. Funnily enough though, a consistent comment I would get frequently from people who saw this card running, either in person or from photos, was just how bright and, well, garish in some cases the RGB could be. Of course, you can control this with MSI's own software, changing the colours of it, how the colours would be displayed, like do you want them to be a consistent colour, rainbow, all of that jazz. But for testing, I just decided to leave things at default and let the rainbow goodness flow. The card also demands 3 8-pin power connectors, which is a lot. Again, make sure that your power supply is up to task here. MSI recommends at least a 750 watt PSU. Personally, I would go with at least 800 or 850, especially if you're running this on something like an overclocked 10900K. It also says that the power consumption is 340 watts, although I found that this would sometimes inch up a tiny bit higher, particularly when hardware-based ray tracing and DLSS were being used, for example, in something like Shadow of the Tomb Raider or Control. It wouldn't go much higher, but 340 to 350 wasn't uncommon to see. Overclocking, naturally, is a very different story, but we'll touch more on that in a moment. It also goes without saying that the ports are exactly what you would expect. There's 3 display ports, they are 1.4A, and there's also a single HDMI 2.1. So no surprises, but exactly what you would expect. Now let's touch on the specifications of the GPU. Most of the specs here, including the number of CUDA cores, remains consistent with the RTX 3080 Founders Edition card. So MSI haven't, for example, enabled any additional SMs. As well as this, the memory clock frequencies are also identical. We'll touch further on memory in a moment when we get into overclocking, but the real difference is in core frequency. The FE card hits 1710 for its advertised boost frequency, although of course it can go higher, and MSI meanwhile hits 1815, so just over 100 megahertz faster, which obviously does have the immediate benefit of increasing performance. This card is retailing with an MSRP of $749 US, which is $50 more than the MSRP of the Founders Edition card. I have found during testing that this card definitely does have a higher boost frequency than the FE card, often at least 100 megahertz faster, so that is obviously very nice in terms of raw performance, but whether you would be willing to pay this extra cash for a custom card, of course, as always, comes down heavily to you. But the specifications of this GPU are really nothing out of the ordinary. I also do want to quickly touch on the capacitor configuration of this GPU, because there has, of course, been a lot of discussion of 3080s crashing. Certain 3080s had a less than ideal capacitor configuration, and so I do want to quickly mention it for the RTX 3080 Gaming X Trio. I ran on the older drivers as well as the newer drivers, and even with overclocking I had absolutely no problem with my tests anyway for the Gaming X Trio. To my understanding, the X Trio uses a single MLCC block, and there's also 5 SP caps as well, which are also in other sections. Again, it seemed to me like I could not get this card to crash. Believe me, I tried with overclocking and everything else. The only time I could get it to crash is if I went really high. I think it was like 150 megahertz on the core or something like that. Really cranked the memory. Then, of course, you would get general card instability, but we'll go further into that in the overclocking section. So yeah, I personally had absolutely no problems with this card. Naturally, your configuration may vary, but for my tests anyway, I don't think it's one of the cards which exhibits any issues. And now let's move over to performance, which ultimately is why you're coughing up hundreds of US dollars on a graphics card. To this end, we're testing with several different titles, and I've simply decided to not test at 1080p. There is absolutely no point in running an RTX 3080, and I even wager a 3070 when they launch, which is not too long from now as of the time I'm recording this video, simply because even with a 10900K overclocked, I found that 1080p, it was barely touching the GPU. Oftentimes, I was getting like 50-60% GPU usage, even with maximum settings, and that's even on more demanding games. So naturally, we just decided very quickly to throw those results out. As for the rest of the system, we are using an Intel 10900K, courtesy of Intel, as well as a Asus Maximus 12 Extreme motherboard, also courtesy of Intel. 32 gigabytes of Crucial Ballistics memory, courtesy of Crucial, and also an 850 watt PSU, which Deepcool have provided. But with that said, let's look at the performance numbers. I want to begin by looking at the results of Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which is one of my favorite games. These are non-RTX results, max settings DX12. I'll be doing more investigation of RTX and DLSS performance in the very not too distant future, because I'm working on a couple of projects for, or rather with Nvidia. But for the 3080 at 4K scores 84 frames a second for the Gaming X Trio. This is compared to 62 of our RTX 2080 Ti. and the 1080 scores just 31 frames a second. At 1440p, we're actually running again into slight CPU bottlenecks. We only got 150 versus 115 FPS, and the 1080 just about hits 60 FPS in the Shadow of the Tomb Raider built-in benchmark. Metro Exodus, maximum settings without any of Nvidia's shiny stuff like DLSS or hardware-based ray tracing, 70.9 and 112 for 4K and 1440p. This is compared to 49 and 73 for the RTX 2080 Ti. And again, bringing up the rear is the GTX 1080. It's still remarkable, honestly, that the 1080 is still such a fast card, but we're now definitely at the point where the card is starting to really start struggling. And high quality gaming at 1440p, you've probably got, a little more time on it, but still, it's definitely starting to show its age. And now, Horizon Zero Dawn, another game which is extremely demanding. We ran at ultra quality here, 64 FPS and 101 FPS for 4K and 1440p respectively, compared to 41 and 68 for the 2080 Ti, and the 1080 40 FPS at 1440p, which honestly is not bad. I would probably just lock it to 30, honestly, and enjoy a kind of PS4-ish level of performance, but obviously with much higher quality settings than what you would get on something like a PS4 Pro, so that's definitely one option. I would say, of course, that a GTX 1080 now at 4K is just not really doable, and I would definitely suggest that you crank down the settings. Gears 5, another one of my favourite titles actually for when it was released, and also a really good benchmark as well, very scalable. The 4K results, 74 FPS versus 106 or 117, let's say. For the 1440p results, the 2080 Ti, it's 58 and 106. We were again getting situations where we were getting CPU bottlenecks, even at higher quality, which was kind of interesting here. The GTX 1080 at 34 FPS and 65 FPS. And now Borderlands 3 for the MSI 3080 Gaming X Trio, we scored 107 FPS, and our 2080 Ti at 1440p scores 76. And the GTX 1080 we unfortunately could not test with this particular benchmark. We have not had time. I apologize for that. At 4K, we scored 62 FPS for the Gaming X Trio. Meanwhile, the 2080 Ti scored 42 frames a second. Again, unfortunately, we could not test as of the time I'm recording this. With the GTX 1080, we have not had enough time. And unfortunately, we're also missing GTX 1080 results for Far Cry New Dawn as well. At 1440p, we are scoring for the average FPS with the 3080 Gaming X Trio. We are scoring 103 FPS, again at 1440p, and 101 FPS with the 2080 Ti. Definitely ran into a lot of CPU bottleneck there, as you can probably tell from the result. Meanwhile, at 4K, things start to distance themselves a little more. The 2080 Ti, we scored 75 FPS, and the Gaming X Trio, we scored 93 FPS. As for overclocking, we found that the card would hit 115 megahertz with the Port Royal benchmark, although in other tests it would go a little bit higher. It was basically a balancing act between that and memory. Uh, for the fastest Port Royal result, we actually got a 350 for memory, but separate testing, I actually squeezed the memory higher than that to 600 megahertz. But again, your mileage will definitely vary. Port Royal is very sensitive when you start overclocking it and really cranking things to the maximum power limit. With our testing anyway, this seemed to provide the average GPU clock frequency on the core of way north of 2000 megahertz. In fact, we, with overclocking, hit well over 2100 megahertz, but obviously that clock frequency would go up and down. So then, let's draw some conclusions, shall we? Seems like a pretty good idea. Yeah, the Gaming X Trio card is pretty damn solid. I've reviewed several of MSI's Gaming X lines of cards before, and each time, you know what? They do exactly what you would expect. That isn't to say that this card is a revolution in terms of the Gaming X design. It's very much an evolution, but it does what it says on the tin. And as I said earlier, the card's been absolutely solid for me, which is obviously a really good thing. But in terms of performance, yeah, this card basically, I would say that if you're trying to pair it with anything less than a high refresh rate 1440p screen, you're wasting your money. This card is super comfortable, pushing high frame rates with a 1440p screen, but you're going to also need a CPU which can do the job. As of the time I'm recording this, AMD have not announced the Ryzen 5000 series or Zen 3 CPUs, so you're probably going to need like a high-end Ryzen 3000 series CPU or something like an Intel 10900K to fully take advantage of a 1440p display with this GPU. Even then, there were times like with Doom Eternal that we weren't maxing the GPU out if we were testing at just 1440p, and Doom Eternal is just one example. There are several others that I could mention. At 4K, yeah, this card absolutely kicks butt. It's actually astounding how much of a ray tracing performance improvement that is. And yeah, at this point, especially if you wish to turn on DLSS, 4K is definitely achievable with full hardware-based ray tracing in a game like Control. And I do believe now that we are in the dawn of the ray tracing era. If you're a regular viewer of the channel, you'll know that I've been touting ray tracing and how much I love it for some time, because I am, at the end of the day, just really interested in technology, and graphics technology in particular tickles my fancy. So yeah, I do think that this card has performed absolutely wonderfully. It gets a pretty good recommendation from me. Of course, we will naturally be fully testing out AMD's GPUs too, the RX 6000 series. I do believe that AMD will be extremely competitive to Nvidia when they do finally launch their GPUs. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens in the market, particularly in terms of pricing. And yeah, I'm very curious to see how the market transitions over the next couple of months, especially as both companies start filling out their product stack with cards such as the RTX 3060s, which obviously we do know exist, and the lower end RDNA 2 GPUs. But with that said, thank you very much for watching the video. The normal stuff, if you have enjoyed it, like, share, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.